Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to GDC Showcase. I'm Brian Francis, a contributing editor at gamasutra.com and maker of things here at GDC. I'm joined today by a very special guest for today's Ask Me Anything session. Please give a warm welcome to Sucker Punch co-founder Brian Fleming. Brian, would you please introduce yourself?
Well, thanks, Bryant. First, just got to say I'm super glad for the opportunity to talk to people today. So as you said, I'm one of the founders here at Sucker Punch. So I've been here since the very, very beginning, all the way on the N64 days. And most recently, of course, we finished a huge project, Ghost of Tsushima, and launched it last year.
Awesome. And just to be clear, he's Brian, I'm Bryant. I've got the T at the end of my name. Now, to get things rolling, we are here, obviously, because you, yes, you in the chat, want to ask your questions for Brian about Sucker Punch's excellent 2020 game, Ghost of Tsushima. I really love this game. I am super excited to be moderating this chat. I can't stress enough that I put hours and hours and hours into it. So normally I would love to ask these questions, but I'm giving up that time so that you all can do the asking. You can ask questions about Ghost, or if you want to know more about Brian's experience in the game industry, that's also on the table. Just kind of a reminder that obviously as a game developers conference, we are asking questions that are relevant to game development. But hey, we find a way to make everything work here. With that in mind, I'm going to go over to the chat and start pulling some questions for us. We've got some ones coming in
excited to see them.
All right. Let's get started here. Thomas Bellotti would like to know, what is your favorite feature activity that didn't make it into Ghost of Tsushima, if there were any, and what will be the reason they were cut?
Well, there's probably lots, and some of those, our favorites are probably, things we keep in the hopper for future games.
Mm-hmm.
I think that some of the really terrifically bad ideas often end up being really good ideas in the long run. We had a whole bunch of ideas about how to do wayfinding in the world, and a lot of those bad ideas then were replaced when you add in something like the guiding wind, and you really feel that sense of progress when you're making the game. That was a few years before we shipped, but it's those moments where you have something that's not working and you transition to something that's really working, that for me on the system side is some of the most entertaining and enjoyable stuff that we do. I guess the other stuff you end up cutting most often is just for scope. You have one too many mini games or one too many interactions, and maybe some of those mini games will show up in some future work. So
that's a good answer. I especially like pointing out that, like the guiding wind, didn't just emerge from thin air. It came from iteration. Although wind should emerge from air. I don't know. Let's go to Brandon Ledbetter's question. When working on a game of this scale, how do you manage ideas and features, and when do you decide to start cutting? That actually plays off the last one really well.
Right. Yeah. We talk about scope is everything. Sucker Punch is not a particularly large team. We're not small. At our peak, we were probably 150 people, and that includes our QA staff and all the things you need to run a business. And so not a huge team. And so scope from the very beginning was the entire, it was a conversation throughout. And so strangely, we feel like we were cutting constantly. And I think that's part of the healthy process, is that the things that you decide to cut kind of give room for the things that are actually really good about the game to have space and to grow. And so I would say really from year one all the way through to 3 months before the game shipped, we were cutting. It might have been smaller things. You might be cutting a scene that isn't working, or an individual lines of dialogue to sharpen things up. But it's the scalpel is one of the most important tools that we wield, and certainly we did throughout the process of making Ghost.
We're going to switch paths here. The question that folks in chat are seem most excited about. We've got this great thumbs up system you guys can use to just thumbs up the questions you want to hear answered. From Rafael Smears Moraes, Japanese players largely praise Ghost of Tsushima for being one of the games to most accurately represent Japanese culture to date. Their question is, what were the procedures to ensure the game would execute such a good representation of that culture?
Well, I think from the very beginning, the original pitch, it was part of our, we were aware of sort of the level of responsibility that we had to have in this area. So there's a story that the fans may know, which is that we actually pitched this to Shu Yoshida. He was one of the very first people we ever pitched it to, because we wanted not just his guidance and his assessment, but really his blessing that, hey, this could be done, that a team from the West could really do this. And with his support, then we began engaging with a wider audience, and that almost immediately included the team at Sony ISD, the Japan team, and their participation in the game throughout, from the original pitches to each of the videos that we would show. They would reflect back to us the parts of the visuals and the parts of the story and the parts of the characters, the names of the characters, all the details that they found that both worked well and the things that were not working for them. And we were, super appreciative of that feedback and responsive as a result. And so that process was really a healthy part of the ongoing development throughout. And certainly without their guidance, we would never have achieved what we achieved. And there's even little stories, and one of the details that I really love is that team was so committed to the project that they made sure that every single kanji in the game, that they understood that kanji actually existed in the 13th century. And so if they had, there are often multiple different ways to describe something, and they went and found the exact kanji that would have been used back in that time to make sure that we were being authentic even at that level. So tremendous effort and partnership with that team.
Oh, that's such an excellent anecdote. It sounds like international cooperation, is one of those things that makes these possible.
And, it's just one of the joys of the project was being committed to being a learner, not remotely pretending that we understood it, to recognize that we needed to go learn and that you had to go find your selection of teachers and mentors to really help us on that journey.
Gotcha. We're going back to Thomas Bellotti here, who seems to be asking some really questions that are resonating with chat. What were the biggest hurdles transitioning from the infamous series to Ghost of Tsushima?
It's a great question. I think the single biggest change for the studio was, Infamous was an open world game, but a kind of a small open world, and we were going to a large open world. And effectively that change, kind of across the board, destabilized every aspect of our game making tool set. We had, all the ground in Infamous would be hand modeled by a 3D artist. There's no way you're going to 3D model the individual vertices of something as big as this. So you have to change that. You have to change we went from, like 100 tiles to 1,200 tiles. The tiles were 4 times bigger. Everything broke. And so the biggest challenge really was the journey to getting to the point where we had solid earth under us again. Because for really many, many months, 18, 24 months, things were still really quite difficult to synthesize into a game you could sit down and play, because there was just so much that used to work that was not able to deal with the scope of what we were doing. So first couple of years were actually quite difficult at getting the game to stand up. And then as we got farther into it, you sort of at least had, you weren't sinking into the swamp constantly, and you could begin to iterate and make progress.
Talking more about the kind of the nuts and bolts making of Ghost of Tsushima, Mohammed Al Salman, hope I pronounced that right. Feel free to correct me in the chat. What was the hardest feature to implement in the game, and why was it so hard?
Yeah, it's an easy answer, and the answer was combat. The combat system was something that, the team that worked on that, handful of programmers and designers and animators, they worked on nonstop for 6 years. We worked, and built multiple versions of it with multiple approaches. And, you're really dealing, the term I use for it is kind of ring zero. I always think of a bullseye, and the combat system, along with a few other systems, like the way that the hero moves through the world, they're kind of the center of everything. And they have to work in every situation. They have to work in every lighting condition. They have to work in every terrain. They have to work in every strange mode that the game might be in. Combat could potentially break out in. And so as a result, they are just exceedingly constrained, right? You have to, it's not an isolated part of the problem where you can just say, oh, well, in this case, we'll just ignore button inputs. Nope, can't do that. Oh, in this case, we'll ignore damage. Nope, can't do that. Oh, we'll ignore ground matching. Nope, can't do that. So combat, and I think, you have on top of that, this goal of making it so that it isn't so simple that you can just push X, but isn't so complicated that the player's head explodes trying to deal with the control scheme and the different modalities. And so it was an elusive, nonstop effort for that team over, literally a 6-year journey, continuing to work on that. And I think the results were really good, but it was a long, difficult road.
Gotcha. We're going to pivot the discussion subject lately to talk about the game industry, getting into it, living in it, surviving in it. Both Connor Shaw and Christopher Zawatowski would like, they're asking a question of the same vibe. So I'm going to read Connor's copy, but they're both asking it. Copy. Can you elaborate on your path into the game industry? Would you recommend your pathway to others hoping to break in? What are specific lessons you would impart on students and other hopefuls?
Well, I'm old enough that the industry is changed a ton, so I don't know if my path is exactly right. I worked on games when I was a college student. I worked at Epix making an old Apple II game called California Games. So I had some experience with it. And then I walked away and worked in commercial software at Microsoft for a number of years, and then came back to games when I started Sucker Punch. And so the start of Sucker Punch was pretty bruising because there weren't any really good entry points. PC gaming at that point was kind of going really, really quite difficult. Console gaming was great, but you really had a tough time getting Nintendo or Sony to give you even a development kit because you were a small, coming out of nowhere studio. And so I think right now it's actually better. It's a better situation because there's a ton of different platforms and entry points for small teams. And my advice is go make games, figure out how to make games and keep making them. Because we when we ship Ghost, I've said, and I truly believe that anyone who ever worked at Sucker Punch contributed to this project, because over the years that we've been making games, we've been learning how to, in fact, make better and bigger games. And we don't make Ghost without Infamous, and we don't make Infamous without Sly, and we don't make Sly without Rocket. Like, that series of games is a journey that we needed to go on. And so my biggest advice is just make games, find a way to make games and continue that journey. There's no substitute for building and shipping games, because you will learn more by doing that than I think anything else.
While I grab the next question here in chat, excuse me, I just wanted to say that a couple folks did give they said they gave a shout out to California Games. So if anyone else played California Games, I haven't, unfortunately.
Well, I wrote the assembly language hacky sack and surfing games. So if you want to go play, get your emulator fired up and go play them. Those are the games I worked on.
Amelia Sylar Alguita would like to know what would be one thing you would have done differently during the development of Ghost of Tsushima, with obviously hindsight being 2020.
That's a good question, and one I really haven't thought a lot about. I think the regrets that when we talk about things as a team, it's going back almost to the question about cutting. I feel like we maybe waited too long on some of those cuts. And it is really difficult. Oh, I know the answer to this question. I'll give you a different answer. So cutting, I think being brave about cutting earlier would have served us better. I think we postponed some of those cuts, and as a result, we spent more time on the stuff that was going to get cut anyway. I think if you're in doubt about things, on a game of this scope, you probably ought to cut it because you have so much other content. The other big, I think, aha lesson for us was that complexity will overwhelm the game and the player. And the reason for this is that the game is so big and has so many systems and interactions that you tend to think about, hey, we're working on combat, or and then another team is working on navigation, and another team is working on mini games. And each of those teams can think, oh, I need to make my part individually rich and detailed. And the problem is when you have so many different components and they're all rich and detailed, the player can get overwhelmed. So I think if I had any big takeaway that I wish I knew going in was make sure that each of the individual systems are almost held to the standard of being as simple as you can make them, rather than thinking, oh, each one needs to be complicated. You ought to really focus on each one being simpler, because the combination of all of them is actually quite complicated. So,
ooh, that was a really thorough answer. Joaquin de Losada would like to know, how do you guys know how long a game production will take to make, and how do you all make sure that the company is able to meet the deadlines? Obviously, game production is fluid, but it's still scheduling. It's how games get made.
Well, the real answer is we didn't. We are in a situation, and we're very fortunate to be in a situation where our relationship with Sony, and we've made games together for almost 2 decades at this point. And I think we have a very healthy relationship with them where we both understand that the real goal was to make a game like Ghost. It wasn't to make a game at a particular date. It was to create something that was a great experience for players, and it was a new IP, and it needed to reach a certain level of success. And so if that took us a little longer, that was the right path. But that only comes because Sony is confident that we're not being wasteful and that we're, really diligently protecting their investment. We are continuing to make progress. But that, it would be quite difficult, I think. We did not originally forecast a 6-year project, and it was on the strength of the progress we'd made and on the strength of our relationship with Sony that everybody agreed we should keep investing to try and find the true diamond that we thought was there, even if it meant it was going to take a little longer. So it was a difficult miss, and we were not close. We did not forecast 5.5, and it turned into 6. We were not close on how long it would take. And again, I think it's really just a reflection on our relationship with Sony that we were able to finish and complete such a good game.
Yeah. Alexandra Soria would like to know how, and this may be a question more for the programming side, but it was it resonated with me because I loved the fast loading so much that I wanted to ask it. How did the team manage to achieve such an optimization that it made it possible to load the game so fast?
It's a great question, and I have to say we were all pretty shocked at the reaction. Again, we lived in this world where the game worked the way it worked for years. And so I think when we shipped and the news was like, oh my God, the game loads so fast, and we kind of had taken it for granted how big of a deal it was. The engineering team did a spectacular job and the art team, once the engineers had done their work, at really understanding what was sort of core to the game and we didn't have to reload all the time, and then what was localized in and around the player and that we could bring in. And they did some clever things where we have really low resolution versions of all the textures in the game so that we can begin to do the fades while we're still finishing the last little bits. So there's cleverness here, but the truth is that I think if you had Adrian, one of our lead engineers, on, he'd tell you it was just the basics. It was just being careful about organizing the data so that it could be loaded without seeking the head all over. And it was just good, solid engineering work. And then, of course, the artists did a great job working within those constraints. So kind of ordinary success.
Speaking of artists, that is what you call a segue. Valerie Bourdon has a great question. One of the most memorable elements from Ghost of Tsushima were the visuals and the art direction. Hard
Yeah.
agree, Valerie. How did Sucker Punch go about creating assets that were historically accurate and yet had a dynamic and vibrant feel? And I guess we can throw in there that they also were, optimized and worked within the constraints of the engine, I guess.
Yeah, Jason Cannell, who leads the art team and was the art director on the project, I think one of the things that we had from the beginning was a fairly clear idea of what we were trying to do with the game, and that certainly includes the visuals. And as we started pushing forward on things that we wanted to achieve visually, a lot of the inspiration came from the source material. You look at Kurosawa movies and all the movement and wind that he used. And so that was a big push for the team to capture that sense of movement. And so that was an early investment point. And then early in the project, the team made a couple of trips to Japan, and they go to Tsushima, and they went to historically preserved locations to kind of draw that inspiration from the reality. And the combination of all of that leads you into the directions that we went. So, you have kind of the source material and visits to the Tsushima. You have the inspiration from the Kurosawa films, and then our exploration really was just how do we capture that? And I think the last really big, center point for Jason was just continuing to try and remove noise from everything, to look at the individual textures, the individual shapes, and look for simpler, less sort of noisy shapes, because it added a sort of sense of calmness to the world. And I think the combination of all of that, and it's just a long journey, but hopefully a successful one.
Yeah. Antti Lenonen here has a great question, I think, is about leadership. Usually in a game project at the start, everything is shiny and exciting. After working on something day to day for many years, the shine and excitement naturally fade away and it becomes hard to stay motivated. How is your team stay motivated for such a long production cycle? And I'll tack on to the end of that, as a studio co-founder, like, what are the ways you think you can do to help keep folks motivated as a leader?
Well, I don't think we have any secrets. I think that the first thing that really helped us on the project was that I thought the vision for the game was really compelling, that we weren't talking ourselves into it. We believed from the beginning that this was the right project and that it was going to be a successful idea. Now, the challenge is that even after you do the initial pitch, years before you ship the game, I always think that after I've pitched to 100 people at the studio, we show the slideshow, there are 100 different pictures of what this game is going to be at that moment, right? Each person has heard that presentation and they have an idea. And those ideas are similar, but they're definitely not the same, because one person is thinking, oh, the combat is going to be, Souls-like, it's going to be Bloodborne because they just played that. And another person's thinking, oh, the game is Breath of the Wild. And another person is thinking, oh no, it's going to be Infamous because that's the game we just made, and it's going to really be different. And the journey is really helping everybody's vision of the game kind of converge over time, right? And it doesn't converge uniformly, but you try and so every 6 weeks we get together as a team and we do a review of our progress, and we would try and select demonstrations of progress we'd made for two things. You wanted progress that was individually exciting, and maybe it was a tool demonstration or an exciting visual effect that we were going to have, and that's inspiring. But then also things that would help converge everybody's idea of what the game was going to be. And so if we knew that, one of our ideas was that we knew it was going to be an M-rated game, right? But we wanted to talk about that because some people think of M-rated game as you run around and you chop heads off all the time. And so we had to actually have conversations about how does violence get used in the game, and where would if somebody's going to lose, if we're actually going to chop someone's head off, we're only going to do that in narrative. We're not going to do that systemically. And why do we feel that way? And so all of that was about helping each of the 100 people who heard that pitch start seeing more and more of the same game. that process continues throughout the entirety of development, but it's a really essential part of building new IP. It's what makes new IP so challenging.
God, I want to dig into the decision around the mature violence that you just said, but we don't have, I'd love to. Don't have time for that. Gotta keep moving. Before I grab the last few questions for today, we only got about 5 minutes left. So we're gonna get one or two more in before we get out. Before we go, I just wanted to tell everyone they should totally stick around. We've got more great free sessions today, the rest of the week, more great folks from the team, the Demon Souls team, the Spider-Man Morales team are gonna be here later in the week, the GDC Live podcast. I am so excited for all the stuff you guys get to watch just by sticking around here on Swap Card. Also, before they go, Brian, if there are any questions we didn't have time for today, is there a way they can ask them? Is there a way they can get follow-up? What do you recommend?
That's a good question. I would have turned it back to you. Is there a process for them to get you a list of questions? I'm certain we can do an email with you, but all the questions are on your screen right now.
Excellent. Good point. We will figure something out, and we're going to go back to the questions now for the rest of our time here. All questions. Okay. Thomas Bellotti would like to know, what technology are you the most excited about for the future of game making across any discipline?
What am I excited about? The thing that I'm the most excited to get to try is the new PS5 storage system. The loading systems there will change the way that we think about how we make games. It's so fast that even the idea of unloading the things that are just off screen on the camera, and as the player turns, bringing them in just in time is possible. And that really fundamentally could change how we think about making games. So lots of exploration to do there, but I'm intrigued by what that could mean for us.
Ooh. Alexis Harrington has an interesting question. In researching for the game, we talked up front about, researching, and you've mentioned before visiting Tsushima itself. In researching the game, were there any specific resources that the team found extremely helpful? Beyond, we mentioned the Sony team before, but I guess if there's anything you want to throw in.
Well, the critical thing is people, is having the right individuals. For me, there's a book, the Mongol invasions of 1274 and the subsequent invasion that was really helpful for me at just getting oriented into the content. And certainly lots of people looked at that, and there's the numerous reference books. But I think in the end, the critical thing was finding people who knew the culture, knew the history, and who, were able to guide us with their expertise. It was really more about that than a particular resource.
Yeah. I think this might be our last question. Raul Mann has kind of a company leadership question. Since you've been around for a while, what do you think are some of the main directions that Sucker Punch took as a company and as developers to stick around for so long?
I think we've been relatively conservative about hardware. So we never used, our games never required some kind of add-on. It was always sort of aiming at the big part of the market. We've chosen great partners. We worked with Ubisoft first and Sony second. And that's really been helpful. I think we've also always viewed our publishers as partners rather than as adversaries. And I think that's really helped us. I think last, we probably over-indexed on realizing that our team isn't just the Sucker Punch employees, it's our banker and our lawyer and our the person at who does the insurance, who sold us insurance, that really kind of expansively thinking about your team, not as those people are vendors, but those are teammates. I think the more you can really invest in those relationships and people, the more, when the moment comes that you need them, you will have built the relationship that lets you get through the next, whatever it is, the obstacle that you have to overcome.
Roger that. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. We've got to start wrapping things up. Yeah, we can't wait to see what's next for Sucker Punch Productions, and who knows, maybe I'll just hop off when I'm done today and go play some more Ghost of Tsushima.
Sounds good.
I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up a little early. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a good day, and like I said before, stick around. There's more great things happening at GDC Showcase this week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.